What is the new multilateralism and what happened to the global order during the COVID-19 crisis? How this unprecedented healthcare disaster has changed all the sectors way beyond public health? To get the answers to these questions, to discuss some of the most burning issues on the global agenda, I'm very happy to be joined by the World Trade Organization Director-General, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sasha.
Let me start with some of the latest developments, what we've heard here as well at the State of the Union conference. We've heard from Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission here, who said that the European Union is willing to discuss the proposal earlier backed by the United States to waive intellectual property rights for the COVID-19 vaccines. But at the same time, there are some countries that express their concerns, maybe not willing to do that now. What's your take on these developments, and what do you think about how it could possibly add just extra time to even more negotiations when time is really of essence?
Well, thank you very much, Sasha. What is happening right now is that members of the WTO, as you have rightly noted, they are proponents of the intellectual property waiver. Over 100 developing countries have joined South Africa and India in asking for the waiver because they believe it's material to access for developing countries to solve the vaccine inequity issue. But there are also proponents, as you've said, on the other side who believe that the IP waiver may not be the critical issue for increasing volumes. So my job is to make sure that I bring members together to actually sit down and negotiate text that would lead to a pragmatic solution that assures access to developing countries to deal with the vaccine inequity, whilst at the same time making sure we don't disincentivize research and innovation. So that's where we are. The recent pronouncements by the US and so on, I'm sure will give an impetus to the negotiations with people, members being willing to come around the table to negotiate text. That's the only way we'll make progress. But I would also like to add this. There are several factors needed to solve the problem of access inequity for vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. And WTO can play a role in all of them and is playing a role. One is reducing export restrictions and prohibitions so that supply chains can work easily for both final products as well as raw materials and supplies. We also need trained personnel for manufacturing. Then we need to increase manufacturing capacity. 80% of the world's exports of vaccines is concentrated in 10 countries in North America, South Asia, and Europe. And we've seen the problems with that concentration now. So we also need to use either idle capacity in emerging markets and developing countries that is available now and can be turned around in the next 6 to 9 months, and put in new capacity. For instance, Africa, a continent of 1.3 billion people, imports 99% of its vaccines. So I think something needs to be done to improve manufacturing on that side. Then you have the problem of IP. With IP must come technology and know-how. Otherwise, you won't also be able to manufacture the product. So it's a complex problem in 3 parts, as I've explained it. And I hope that members will come together to pull all those 3 parts in order to be able to help increase volumes.
It has been just over a year since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic and this overall crisis. What are the lessons that you draw on it at the WTO?
Well, thank you. Yes, there are many lessons that emanate from the crisis. I think some of the biggest ones everyone has drawn is just how the interconnectedness of the world, just how unprepared the world was for this crisis, whether it's rich countries or poor ones, and the need to make sure that our health systems globally in each country are strengthened to deal with the next crisis. But I think another lesson is just the role of trade. Even though trade contracted last year by 5.3% in volume terms, 7% in value terms, trade played a very strong role in making sure that access to medical supplies and equipment was enhanced. So even though overall trade was contracting, we saw trade in the value of medical supplies and equipment increase by 16%. For personal protective equipment, 50%. So that shows you that the multilateral trading system did contribute to helping to solve the problem of moving medical supplies around. So that's one factor that I think it's important and a good lesson for us to know that we need to strengthen and keep going the multilateral trading system. I think another thing we learned is that supply chains have been quite resilient, much more than people would think. You know, there's all this talk of reshoring, onshoring because of the problems we saw. But you have seen that movements of agricultural products and food have been pretty resilient and steady. I already spoke of medical supplies. And all in all, we find that supply chains have largely worked. Not perfectly, but they've worked. So that's another solid lesson that we've learned. And finally, I would say that the role of trade in making sure that we deal with problems of access to vaccines and vaccine inequity is also very important. And that's where supply chains matter a lot, and issues of transfer of technology and access to issues of patents and intellectual property.
Let me follow up on this one, because of course, over the past year, we also heard calls for restoring production and greater autonomy and self-sufficiency when it comes to the bigger picture of a global trade. Shall we, and if so, how should we rethink global trade and this new multilateralism?
Well, first of all, I think that multilateralism has taken a lot of knocks. And of course, we've seen increasing protectionism, which also comes about from some of the deficiencies in globalization. As we know, globalization has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but it's also left some people behind. There are poor people within rich countries who have been left behind, and there are poorer countries who have not benefited from globalization. But that being said, I think that that the new multilateralism, if you want to call it that, it must be managed and supported in such a way that it can contribute to tackle the problems that globalization did not deal with, and even strengthen the solidarity and cooperation that we need to solve problems of the global commons now. But let me say something. People are talking of protectionism, deglobalization, globalization not working. I prefer to think of it as re-globalization, that the way that globalization is working is being reorganized. We've seen the first wave in which countries like China and Eastern Europe were integrated into the system, resulting in major gains for the world's economies and for those countries. Now we need a second wave in which continents like Africa, countries in Africa, other lower middle income and low income countries in Asia and Latin America need to be integrated and will be reintegrated into the global system. I think that will give another second boost to globalization that will help take care of inequalities that occurred from both the technology developments as well as the first wave of globalization. So let's think of it as re-globalization, you know, a strengthening of multilateralism. That's what I like to think of as the new multilateralism.
And what are exactly those actions that are needed to make sure that we are not going towards deglobalization, but, as you said, that we are moving towards re-globalization with a different view?
Well, first of all, we must make sure that the good things about the multilateral systems, trading system, are kept in place and strengthened. The level playing field, the fairness, the non-discrimination, all the principles, the stability of the system is kept going. That is absolutely necessary. In addition to that, I think we need to see how to bring in, let's say, you know, in most countries in the world, micro, medium, and small enterprises are really the engines of economic growth. They create the jobs, they move goods around. And yet you find that in many countries, they do not participate in the multilateral trading system. They're not on national, regional, and global supply chains. So I think one key issue we need to think about in the reglobalization is how do we bring small and medium enterprises onto these value chains, into the supply chains that deliver goods all around the world. Another area is women and trade. You'll find that in most countries, 50% or more of these small and medium enterprises are owned by women. How do we involve them and bring them in? All these actions, how do we make new rules of trade that will be supportive of these sections of our global economy? I think those are the things we're looking at in WTO to see how the reglobalization can bring in those who have been marginalized in the past.
On the 26th of April, there was the Trade Day 21, and you had an exchange with the European Union's Valdis Dombrovskis about the WTO reforms. Now, can you give us a sneak peek on that one, and how can the European Union weigh into the process of bringing and discussing and finally reforming the World Trade Organization?
What the European Union does is critically important for the WTO and for the world trading system. And we've exchanged a number of ideas that the EU is coming up with regard to WTO reform. And I find those ideas very helpful, very interesting. There are issues of how do we complete some of the ongoing negotiations that the WTO has been involved in. For example, fisheries subsidies negotiations to support sustainability of our oceans. This has been going on for 20 years, and I know the EU and all the other members are very desirous to complete this multilateral round. So we've been talking about how to do that. We've been talking about issues of the dispute settlement system of the WTO, which has been paralyzed, and how do we reinvigorate and reform that. We've been talking of upgrading, bringing the rules of the WTO up to 21st century issues. I just mentioned issues of digital trade and e-commerce. How do we do that? And the EU is very supportive in those areas. And then we come to trade and climate. How do we bring WTO rules to help with the greening and the decarbonization of our economies? Helping us to build back better from this pandemic.
All the WTO members have committed to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and many of those SDGs relate to protection of the environment. In the bigger process of shaping up the new multilateralism and this reglobalization, as you say, how to make sure that trade policy is responsive to climate and environmental challenges?
Well, I think that trade can really contribute substantially to lowering carbon emissions globally, to the decarbonization of our world, and to greening our world. And I think there are many opportunities that we can explore. First of all, in 2016, WTO members were negotiating an agreement on environmental goods and services, which would have helped to incentivize a move towards using cleaner and greener technologies and goods. So there's a possibility, but those negotiations were stalled. So one of the things that we could do, and we are trying to do, is see how to revive those negotiations and see if we can complete them in a way that would be beneficial to members and globally to the environment. Of course, there are issues of how to tackle carbon emissions within the ambit of trade, and various mechanisms, including the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU is looking at, are being looked at and debated. We are also studying this issue at the WTO to make sure that whatever happens will be congruent with WTO rules. And that's what's going on. But we need to look at various instruments that could be applied to help make trade more responsive to the environment. And I think it's an interesting and challenging area, and we're looking forward to doing more work with the EU and with others on the issue of environment.
Looking at the short-term perspective, from 1 to 3 years, let's put it that way, what are some of the probably achievements or goals that you are the most looking forward to?
in the next 1 to 3 years, actually in this first 1 year, I am looking forward to a number of achievements for the WTO and for trade. I think first and foremost, we've got to change the WTO to an organization that achieves results. The image that the WTO doesn't get results is dysfunctional. That has to change. And I see the great potential for changing that, even within this 1 year, by the time we have our 12th ministerial conference in December. And this can be done through focusing on results. First, we have the great opportunity of completing the fisheries subsidies negotiations, which have been going on for 20 years. And I've said, if this is about supporting the sustainability of our oceans and the livelihood of our fisher women and men, we must complete these negotiations. So that's really top priority as far as I'm concerned. It will give us a win. I think the second area that I'd like to see results is on trade and health issues. We have the unique opportunity as the WTO to contribute to the problems we are facing right now with respect to the pandemic. And I've already illustrated that trade, the multilateral trading system, has been part of the solution. I would like us to do more when we complete these negotiations on intellectual property and transfer of technology and know-how. We would have had an instrument that can contribute to solving the problems of access to medical supplies, equipment, and vaccines. So that's a big contribution that we could finalize at our ministerial conference. I think the third area is on agriculture. This is an area of vital importance to all our members, both developing and developed. And we have some areas on food security issues. You know that the multilateral trading system has also assured that food supplies are stable and traded stably around the world. So food security is an important thing. How can we get to some agreements that would be beneficial to members in that area of agriculture? We, of course, have the issue of subsidies in both industrial subsidies and domestic, what we call domestic support, rich agricultural subsidies, which lead members to fear that there's no longer a level playing field with regard to competition in trade between countries. So we need to look at that. That's an area I would like to make some progress. And then let me just say on the dispute settlement mechanism, vital to rulemaking at the WTO, I'd like to see some progress there. So a lot of opportunities in the next 1 to 3 years to rebrand the organization.
Well, as you said, some of those issues have been dragging on and on for years indeed, and we've been watching developments, or in some cases, lack of developments there. And I would really want to ask you this question on when it comes to the developments and sorting out some of these important issues, as you've just mentioned, doing so, being more socially and people-oriented, tackling, of course, some of these inequality problems.
Trade is a means to an end. The end is to develop and improve people's lives. It's all about people. And so the WTO and its instruments should be used to improve the lives of people, whether it's poorer people within rich countries, whether it's poorer developing countries. The rules should be such that we can bring them into the world's trading system and use that as a means to improve their lives. And all of these results that I'm talking about should lead to improvements in people's lives, whether it's in agriculture, where you know many people in developing countries have their livelihood, whether it's in fisheries, we've seen fisheries important to both poor countries and large countries, whether it's in trade and health, and helping to solve the pandemic, or even in environment. Every single area, we have the opportunity to improve people's lives.
Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director-General of the World Trade Organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha.